Afternoon, welcome to ThinkTech Hawaii, time for responsible change. We're going to talk today about minority rule and whatever else kind of comes up and comes to mind. Thanks so much for joining us. Want to remind everybody that even though it's not May anymore, ThinkTech is still in its fundraising support donation period. So please help us out, keep us going. And do what you can. Go to the ThinkTech website, click the donate button, and whatever the spirit moves you to share will be greatly, greatly appreciated. So today we have with us all-star panel, retired Judge Sandra Sims with that lovely Hawaii background and author as well, leading women's rights lawyer and Denton's mainstay, Louise, attorney, partner. We won't call her senior because even though she's been there for decades, she started at 8, and so she's still quite young. Tina Patterson, eminent mediator, arbitrator, and entrepreneur in prior lifetimes. And retired Professor Ben Davis, University of Toledo School of Law, raconteur, man about town in all the most professional senses, and a wonderful contributor always. So welcome aboard, folks.
Be here.
Have we ever seen minority rule in our national government go to the lengths that it is now, in your memory?
Well, yes, in a way. I mean,
Good.
You could argue that the structure of the Constitution, which gave 3/5 vote to the states that had persons enslaved, basically, and put in a kind of minority rule structure from the beginning as part of the deal to get the government in place there. And of course, you could also think of the secession from the Union, from the South, right? Second one. As to now, if I started today, if you look at the map of the United States in terms of red or blue, in terms of counties, right? There's a lot of red counties out there as opposed to blue counties. Of course, now a lot of those red counties just have, it's like Wyoming with cows and chickens, right? So it's not a lot of people. Right? You know what I mean? But the point of just trying to make is, there are majorities in all these states that at least are running things and are trying to suppress the votes of people who are not basically Republicans. And so in that sense, at the state level, you've got majorities in a lot of places. Now we get up to the federal level, and then we have the different, the filibuster primed Republicans that are kind of doing this minority rule thing. So there's kind of this mix, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Good point. I haven't seen it as blatantly and righteously displayed, at least in my lifetime, as we are seeing now, which is distressing and disappointing. And the only reason I can see for it is this fear of change and the fear of a new power structure coming into play. I'd like to think it is something else, but sad to say, it's just a distressing time, and I hope we can overcome it, which is going to require votes and engagement.
Votes and engagement. I think that is the critical piece. I think, as Ben has pointed out, a lot of in the red areas, we're not necessarily talking about a lot of the numbers of people, but that's where the control is. But I think that when we come up on what's going to happen in the next few years, the voting piece is going to be absolutely critical for those, who are in minority communities, because there is clearly, with regard to the issues that we need to address in this country, with regard to those things that need to be taken care of, there is, we know what that is, and we're going to need those votes in order to get those things done. And my thinking is that the voting will tell, and the voting will be the place where some of this. I'm feeling. I feel distress. I feel the distress that you feel, Louise, and that kind of concern. It's not a comfortable time, but I do believe it will become more comfortable. I was in the middle of a conference now, and one of the speakers yesterday made a comment about not letting a good crisis go to waste.
Sure.
This being a time in which we are in the midst of a number of crises. But within those crises often comes the opportunity for the chance to make change. So that was one of the admonishments, was to not let a good crisis go to waste. So that's how I'm feeling about this.
And when we
Well-
talk about votes, Sandra, and certainly we're talking about voices for people, and that's where minority rule kicks in. Last year, there were an estimated 40 pieces of state legislation to restrict voting rights. This year alone, and we're only not even halfway through it, there are over 360. And those bills are becoming laws for voter suppression. So minority rule is not just divisive and violent, as we said, it's intentional.
Yeah.
And it may very well be fear-driven and fear-generating.
Yeah, it is. If I can jump in, I want to push aggressively, so to speak, here in a way, and just speak to the underlying thing, which seems to be a convincing of somewhere between 50%, 40% of white Americans that they're going to lose their place, whatever that place is, which is basically one way to think about it is that if you think of people who have been beneficiaries of oppression, losing the benefits of that oppression and having a hard time dealing with that. And so they're fighting back in a very reactionary way, to the point where they're perfectly willing to go down a fantasy path that actually Hannah Arendt describes in her Origins of Totalitarianism as the kind of fantastical thinking that people are perfectly willing to go through as they sort of get out of touch with reality. They're perfectly willing to go down a totalitarian or fascist path. And it's got a history. Martin Luther King at one point said that there are people in America who are happy to have democracy for themselves and dictatorship for others. And that's what you're watching right now, is that they're basically people who are trying to create more dictatorship for others and democracy for themselves. And it's an old thing in the United States. And obviously you have to combat it. I'm saddened that the federal government, for example, has not instigated civil or criminal cases with regards to the election interference that's called the frauded in Arizona. I think that's purely election interference that is going on, even if it's approved by the state legislator to do it. It's clearly trying to undermine the 2020 election. It's clearly a thing that is violating the integrity of the actual ballots, which are the will of the people. And but the federal government is paying, it's kind of not doing what it needs to do to get to actually take that on. Obviously, I was just going to say that
they're aware of it. I can't believe that it's just sitting there and no one is looking at that. And I agree with you that that's what it looks like, but I can't believe that we're not looking at that. That's not
Yeah.
being examined by the gentleman. I think it very well may be that's what's going on. And even with the, some of the comments that are being made about, I was real concerned about the comments that Flint made
Yeah.
with reference to suggesting that it would be appropriate for there to be a
Military
military
coup.
like coup
Yeah.
in this country. And I would have thought that in that moment, they would just, the agents would just come and take him off the stage in handcuffs. I mean,
Right.
good Lord.
Or at least yank his pension as a former military general, okay, or court-martial him, which he is up for as a retiree. You still can be
You're
court-martialed.
still, yeah.
And
Yeah.
I said, sorry, man, that's sedition. That's an article, whatever, in the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and your pension is gone. See you later. But that's the speed I'd like to see those things happen at. I'd like to go another, if you permit me, Judge. I want to speak to something because Memorial Day just happened, okay? And here in Ohio, there was a lieutenant colonel in Hudson, Ohio, who was making a Memorial Day speech. And part of what he wanted to talk about was after the Civil War, Black soldiers exhumed or disinterred soldiers who had been buried in mass graves in order that they could have a respectful, honorable funeral, right?
Mm-hmm.
The organizers of the Memorial Day event didn't like that in his speech, but the lieutenant colonel was a white guy, insisted he'd have it in his speech. But then when he actually was given the speech, they turned the mic off during those 2 minutes when he's talking about that. Now, to me, that is revelatory of the exact kind of what's called whitewashing the past that is trying to be inflicted on all of America right now with regards to not having the complete history of America or more of the history of America being part of what is learned by everybody, but to come back to some kind of Disney version of American history. That's one of the things that really troubles me, is that there are actually laws being passed in states saying you can't talk about this, which I find is insane. Another part of the insanity, in addition to the voting. But
Ben, you mentioned that this week has made me think about, and it's come up, and it's not old news for many of us, but where this month news outlets are covering the story of this is the 100th anniversary of the massacre in Tulsa.
Yeah.
And to talk with people over the age of 50 who said, I've never heard of this before.
Yes.
It is that erasure of history. It is not saying that Greenwood is one of several communities, and it wasn't just 1921, 1919. It was a 6-year period in which locations across the United States were burned to the ground. Not any location, but locations where you had people of color, Blacks, who were prosperous, and other communities as well. So, the summer of racial terror, or some people call it the Red Summer, and they obviously made a mistake in thinking it was referring to communism. It's not. The red is referring to the blood as well as the fires in those communities. But to hear the media, this is something new. This is, oh my gosh, we're just discovering this. Ask the elders, ask the people in the community. They know and have been talking about this. We tell our young people, and it's not talked about in some schools. It's taken out of the books. The way that the massacre in Tulsa is described as, well, it was just, an untimely event. No, it was actually 3 days of burning and pillaging and killing people at random. And it's, again, not just Tulsa, it's other locations. And to me, this is reflective of really the disintegration of who our history,
right,
how we look at law, and how we look at democracy. I don't remember which organization it was, but there were a group of scholars who said, we need to be very concerned. The rule of law is in jeopardy. How we function as a democracy is in jeopardy. And the response was silence.
Yeah. Yeah, the silence is always there. I wanted to just broaden this a little bit, is that, I think it was when Teddy Roosevelt was president, he was talking to the mayor of San Francisco about trying to address the lynching of Asians in San Francisco, particularly Japanese immigrants, because it was causing a problem with Japan. This is like in 1910, around the same time as all this other stuff was going on.
Yes.
And, there's so many swirls in this. And I think one of the things that moves me the most is seeing this 107-year-old lady testifying for Congress, who only was able to go to a 4th grade education because of the riots. They had to go away. Their schools were destroyed and all that. And she's still suffering today on nickels and dimes trying to make it. And I'm saying, how is it possible that this lady has to worry about one nickel in her life with what she went through, that this country can't see itself, even somebody who is a benefactor in Tulsa, I'll go that far, who would just say, ma'am, here's a check for $500,000. I do know that they're in Toledo, and not in Toledo, in Detroit, for Rosa Parks. There was a guy who said, Rosa, your stuff is taken care of.
I remember that.
And it wasn't, he wouldn't make a lot of noise about it. He just want to let you know, Rosa Parks, your stuff is taken care of. You don't have to worry about it. And still, there's not somebody with the human decency to look at that 107-year-old lady and say, ma'am, I got lots of money. I'm going to take care of you. And even though she should have more, I'm not saying anybody else shouldn't have any either. But I just saw those 3 over 100-year-old people, and I said, it's not right that people still can't think of them as human, as people who have suffered for 100 years and can't see their way to kind of, let's open our hearts, and whatever your religious tradition is, but let's open our hearts to them, It's a sickness. But we don't have it. We don't have that sickness, not us.
Well, we just saw that happen yesterday in Honolulu with a candidate for our police chief, 70-year-old white man. I think he had some experience here, but came in from the mainland. He was asked by commissioner, is there racism in Hawaii? And he said, I'm not aware of any. And just go, what?
I know.
Yeah. It's from his perspective, he never experienced it, so it doesn't exist.
Well, I do know that there are white people who said, geez, it wasn't until George Floyd that I realized I had white privilege. I'm like, wait a minute, we are literally 70 years after Brown. Okay, I'm 65 years old. And I've lived the 65 years. And you're going to tell me that it's only today? Surprise? It's just unbelievable, the capacity for people to be in denial of the benefits that they get. And just, I've only asked for a modest amount of humility about it. I'm not asking for something great, okay? But like I've said to Tina before, I know I benefited from gender discrimination for my first big job, because there were only men in that particular role. There were no women, and it was only 8 years later that the first woman got into that job, right? I know that. I recognize it. I did my best at my job, to try to do the best at it. But I know I had a leg up because of that. But just saying, with racial discrimination or disabilities or what else? Sexual orientation stuff.
All of those issues.
Or poverty. There's different kinds of situations that you benefited if you didn't have to go down that hoop. Yeah. And you minus just a little modest humility about how great you are. Just recognize that even though you worked hard, you fought hard, you got a chance to fight. That's all I'm asking for. Yeah. And you can't get that from people. It's like, no, I made it all on my own.
No, you didn't.
No, you didn't.
No, you didn't.
Nobody. I don't know anybody made it all on their own. No.
But you know what we're also kind of seeing, though, even with those kinds of incidents with regard to the general and the candidate for police commission, when he made that statement yesterday to the effect that there was not this discrimination, there was an outpour of like, excuse me, wait a minute, enough that we're beginning to see more and more people being aware of what our history really is, and it's
Mm.
not pretty.
No,
It's not
no,
pretty, and I think we have a generation, particularly the younger folks, who are not going to be intimidated by attempts at repressing their access to knowledge, their access to accessing their rights. They're not gonna sit down with that. They're not gonna take it sitting down. Even when it comes to the issue of education about our history. Sure, they're passing these laws or saying, you can't teach this, but you know, it's gonna get taught. It's gonna get out there. This generation is just not going to allow that to occur. I mean, you even seeing it in Tulsa. I mean, as much as I didn't realize I didn't know much about Tulsa myself until I knew about it before now. But the fact that it was so actively suppressed
yeah,
was
yeah,
what was unnerving to me. It's like you actually attempted to erase this out of our
yeah,
history. I mean, you really did try to take that out. I
yeah.
mean, and to think that, whoa, when that opens up, then there's going to be more areas opening up in our history, and Black history, in Asian American history, in Native Hawaiian history. I mean, the same thing is happening in the Hawaii community. I mean, there's some ugly things that have occurred here,
Mm.
and people are just like, wait a minute, this is not going to happen to us again. The story is going to be told, and we are going to tell it, and you are going to hear it, and you will not be able to unhear it because it's
I just,
there. And
and I really
we
do think
move from there.
I really think it'll free a lot of people from a lot of bad, a lot of just crazy stuff that they were raised to believe. It just will free them.
Yeah.
The whole pieces of it. Like one of the things I loved to learn about in Tulsa was that there were the Creek Indians, Creek Native Americans who were there, and they had Black slaves, right? And there was a whole expulsion that happened there. So there's like a Native American, African American thing that had gone on as part of this. To me, that was interesting to understand some of these complicated dynamics that were going on, because I have some Cherokee in me, and so it's like, oh, this is part of the swirl of all this country. So I mean, I understand people being fearful and they're worried about, oh, my kid's not going to get a place or something like that. But I'm like, hey, man, you just want to have the gravy train. That's all you want is a gravy train, and you want the gravy train to keep coming for you. And then you're surprised that somebody else might say, geez, I'm not sure that the gravy train should only go to you. You know what I mean? And you watch people getting so upset like they were entitled to the gravy train. They were raised to think they were entitled, but they're not entitled.
No.
That's just the
Okay.
trip in their head.
But there
I
is
love the
that
way you put it.
zero-sum mentality, yeah, that
Yes.
they have
Yeah.
to take from those who seem
Mhm.
unlike them in order to have what they have. That
Well, you
is,
put
Well,
it so
you
you put
always
it
got to
so
go
well,
back.
man.
Right? I mean, I'm just trying to say that you always go back to this thing where, to ultimately rationalize anything like this, you have to think of some people as being inferior to you, and that
Mhm.
therefore you're entitled to.
But
That's
yeah, I
basically.
mean, that's how it's done. The thing of it is, even though, like you said, there's this fear piece, and there's this thinking that there's not, I got to get it because I can't let you have it. The truth of the matter is, I mean, we have enough resources for everyone to achieve what they want to accomplish. And we've had this thing of, there's this need to make it appear as though we're having to, fight to exist.
Yeah,
It
right.
isn't
Oh,
necessary. There is
I just
there is
barely
a
got my 30-room mansion here. I'm telling you, it's been hard. 30-room mansion.
That's all you
You
got.
don't know what it's been like.
That's all you got.
That's
But
all
no,
I
I
got.
mean, I do have that sense that we're like fighting over stuff that doesn't exist, fighting over that there is a lack of resources.
Right.
There's a lack of sources, of income
Scarcity.
or scarcity or access, and there just isn't. we just need to, like you say, acknowledge what our sordid history is and move forward from that. Of course,
I
you have
see hope that at least there is a national conversation going on more broadly. And there's a
Exactly.
lot more talk about let's seize the time. And that even goes for AAPI. I would say this was the most active AAPI month that I have seen back in May.
Yes.
I agree
Yes.
with
Really?
Louise.
Much more national conversation going on, and we need to make sure it stays that way.
Yeah.
Hey, that's
Yeah.
good.
And it certainly helps to have a Kamala Harris in position who can address all of these issues with her
Yeah,
own
it's like
life
dualities. Yeah.
experience and be an advocate. And then that we have a president who's willing to say that Tulsa was a massacre and not a riot.
And as we come into our last couple of minutes here, I know, Tina, you had some things on your mind. You looked like you were ready.
I think we, like any change and transformation, it's slow. Sometimes it's glacially slow. And I think we are in the midst of this transformation. I'm thinking about the massacre in Tulsa and the lynchings that took place in the United States. There was a time when postcards were mailed at these events. And I'm using the word events very nicely, intentionally, but they were mailed. And the US Postal Service, after about 2 years, stopped because people found the pictures to be
Wow.
too gruesome to
Yeah.
be mailed directly. So what did people do? They put them in envelopes and mailed them just the same.
Yeah.
I share that because it requires a change of mind. It requires not just talking about what we're thinking, but liberating minds as well as hearts. So I just see it as it's going to be gradual, slowly wearing down, and some of us won't make it, and some of us will forge ahead, as you said earlier. We move forward.
And so maybe one of the things in our last minute that we need to help set the stage for when we come back in a couple of weeks is, how do we offer the youngest minds the opportunity for that learning, for that experience, to move away from that zero-sum, competitive, divisive entitlement model?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
We certainly, we certainly got to make sure that they get the education, I mean, that they actually get to know they don't have to relearn at 25 things that they said they didn't learn, but it should be part of what they learn in 10 and 15 and all that. Anyway, I just go on sometimes. You excuse me, Judge.
That's okay.
So maybe one of the biggest things we wrap up with today and come back to next time is, let's give some thought to how they learn, what they can learn.
Yeah.
What we really need to share with the youngest minds that offer the greatest hope and potential.
That's great.
That's
with
our
that-
future.
That's a
And
great
what they
idea.
can and what they can teach us.
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. The gift
Sandra,
of
thank you.
resilience.
Louise, Tina, Ben, thank you all.
Thank
Folks,
you.
come back in a couple of weeks. There will be more, and we will do our very best to make it worth your while. Take good care.
Definitely worthwhile, Chuck. It's definitely